Hi there, this is Brittany from By Brittany Goldwyn. I post videos about plants and projects, and today we are talking about the right way to water your houseplants. I know that probably sounds super easy and like you don't need a video for it, but it's entirely possible, especially if you're new to taking care of houseplants, that you are not watering your houseplants the right way. And that's because there's a big difference between overwatering, which you should not be doing, and deep watering, which is very good for your plants. So I will walk you through how to deep water your plants, talk about why it's good for your plants, and then we'll wrap up with a couple of things I recommend adding to your watering routine to help your houseplants thrive. So let's get started. So you've probably been told a million times not to overwater your houseplants, but overwatering your houseplants is less about how much water you give them and more about the frequency of the watering and how long you let the soil stay wet. If you give your houseplants a little bit of water every few days, that's not going to be good for them. It's just going to get that top few inches of the soil wet. It's not going to reach the roots, and it might even attract things like fungus gnats and mold growth, because the fungus gnats really like to lay their eggs in the top few inches of moist soil. Instead of this frequent shallow watering, it's better to water your plants less often and give them a deep, thorough soaking water. I like to do this by carrying my plants over to my kitchen sink, which is what I'm standing in front of right now, or for some of my larger plants, I will carry them into the shower or will even drag them outside during the summer to water them if it's warm enough. So let's run through a practical example of what I mean by deep watering. Now, here I have my variegated Hoya carnosa compacta. You can see it's in a terracotta pot with a very chunky soil in it, which is exactly what these Hoyas like. And it's also in a pot with a drainage hole in the bottom. And that is a very important part of deep watering because you want all that extra water that you're putting in the pot to have somewhere to go. Now, this is exactly what you want. A deep, thorough soaking of the water that allows the plant's roots to soak up what they need while all of the excess water it doesn't need can drain through the soil, out the drainage hole, and down the drain. See it coming out of the bottom there? This is also a great way to flush out the soil, as sometimes there can be some mineral buildup, and just flushing it out like this is super helpful. Now, if you go to water your plant and you notice that the soil inside is kind of caking and shrinking away from this perimeter of the pot, I recommend taking something like a chopstick or a fork and just kind of gently aerating it all around the perimeter to mix it up and break things up a little bit. And this is because when you deep water, if the soil is too compacted and caked together, you're not going to get water going to the plant's roots. Instead, you will likely have the majority of the water running down the sides of the caked soil, the sides of the inside of the pot, and running out. So those roots will not get what they need to thrive. And sometimes when you're deep watering, as with this plant here, you can see that the water is taking a little bit of time to soak down into the soil and it's bubbling up a bit. That is totally fine. You don't want to flood out all of the soil from the pot, so just wait until it soaks in and then give it a second round. You know you're done when you start to get a good amount of water flowing out of the bottom of the pot's drainage holes. And it looks like this one is about done. We know that all of the water has reached the plant's roots because we are seeing that water come out of the drainage holes. So that means that the soil is likely thoroughly soaked. So as for how often you should be deeply watering your houseplants, this is really going to depend on a lot of factors, unfortunately. But don't worry, you can get the hang of it with your plants. It's going to depend on the type of soil that you have your plants in. So if it's a heavier mix, it's going to retain that water for a lot longer. If it's a super chunky, lightweight mix, like I have a lot of my Hoyas in, that's going to lose moisture a lot faster and not retain nearly as much. It's also going to depend on the time of year, the temperatures, the amount of light your plant is getting. And for all of these reasons, I don't recommend watering on a strict schedule. Now, you will find that once you get to know your plants and your needs and you keep them in the same spot, you will fall into a bit of a watering routine. Less of a schedule, more of a routine with your plants as you get to know them. As a general rule of thumb, for most of my plants, which are, my house plants are, I have a lot of Hoya, I have Monstera, Philodendron, Syndapsis, Epiphyllum. That makes up the bulk of my current collection, I would say I like to let the pot dry out at least halfway before I water the plant again. That way I can ensure that I'm letting the top of that soil dry out, I'm not letting the plants go too long before watering them again, and I'm not going to drown the roots with the lack of oxygen that consistently waterlogged soil can lead to. So now that you have your deep watering routine down, here are a few other things you can do to help your houseplants thrive. Now, when I deeply water my plants in the sink, you probably notice with my demos with my other plants that I like to rinse down the foliage. Now, cleaning off plant foliage is really challenging on some plants, especially a plant like this shingling Monstera dubia. It's tough to clean these off leaf by leaf individually. I just do not have the time or the patience to do that. So when I'm deeply watering these plants, take it out of its cache pot here so that all of the extra water can flow out, I like to rinse it down as best I can, trying to get behind the leaves here. Get a better view. Trying to get behind the leaves because that's where pests like to hang out a lot of the time. Now, rinsing off your leaves with water when you are watering the plant is an excellent pest management best practice. If there's anything crawling around on there, it's definitely possible that you could preemptively avoid a pest infestation by knocking it off in the early stages. It's also good for cleaning the dust off the leaves. Now, it's far better than using any sort of over-the-counter leaf shine product, which really I would not recommend using for your plants. They're not great for plants. They really just make it harder for the plant's foliage to breathe, which it needs to do to stay happy and healthy. Another tip for making your watering routine a little bit easier is grouping plants with similar watering needs. So while I might not have a strict schedule I'm watering my plants on, I do keep, for example, a lot of my hoyas in this corner of the room on a tower. So when I'm watering them, I can carry them 2 or 3 at a time if I'm being adventurous, over to the sink at the same time and then deep water them all together. I will then set them on a towel on the side of the sink to dry off a little bit before I carry them back in here to put them back on their tower. And before we wrap up, I will say that I often see people recommending only using distilled or filtered water, never using tap water for your plants. I am here to say that I always use tap water for my plants. We have treated city water where we are. We have not experienced any issues with our plants whatsoever in the many years that I have had them. We've also been watering our plants with 2 different types of water since I've been collecting houseplants, and again, have not noticed any differences. We're not on a well or anything like that, so our water has all of the stuff in it that you theoretically should not be giving to your plants. However, I'm pretty lazy and I do not have the time to let water fill up in buckets and then sit out overnight before I water my plants. That said, the composition of your water might be a little different, so if you are experiencing any issues with your plants and you want to rule out water being the issue, I would recommend, if you don't want to use filtered water or buy distilled water, just fill up a big bowl of tap water and let it sit overnight so that some of the things in your water can dissipate before you add them to the soil. And that about wraps up everything that I think you need to know about watering your houseplants. It's everything I do, and my houseplants have been very happy and healthy for many years now. Just remember, a deep, more infrequent watering is much better than more frequent, shallow waterings, and really don't stress about it too much because they're plants, and a lot of plants are very, very resilient. After all, they have evolved to live in our homes, which is not where they're supposed to live. So, until my next video, happy planting.